In my video about Mark Carney's speech at Davos, I talked about why it struck such a nerve. What Carney did was put into words something many countries have been thinking for quite a while, but don't often dare to say out loud. In other words, that the old assumptions just don't hold the way that they used to. And middle powers can't afford to drift. That message resonated because it wasn't ideological, it was descriptive. And it matched what governments around the world are already dealing with. So, for example, down here in Australia, we have free trade agreements with both China and the United States. But in the last few years, new tariffs imposed by both the superpowers have meant that these agreements have been honoured in the breach, which does leave me wondering how much value they actually have. And over the past 12 months, Australia has hosted delegations from around the world, including countries who we don't usually see frequently in Canberra at this particular level. For example, I met with delegations from Poland, from the Czech Republic, from Chile, and there were many, many others that I wasn't a part of. Now, the point is that these weren't courtesy visits. They were about trade, energy, defense, critical minerals, and supply chains. And they reflect a shared unease about where the system is heading and a shared interest in having more options. And that context matters because a new approach does not mean being anti-United States, and it doesn't mean being anti-China. Australia can't afford that because we are uniquely exposed to both markets at the same time, more than any other country in the world. And so that means that we rely on the United States for security. It is our key defense partner, and it accounts to 10 to 12% of Australia's total trade. China, on the other hand, is our largest trading partner, and it accounts for nearly 30% of Australia's global trade. That is a lot. We don't get the luxury of opting out of either relationship. We have to keep both going, and we have to make sure that we work well with both. But working with the US and working with China doesn't mean that we have to stop there. Prime Minister Carney was really arguing for, and what I think Australia should be moving towards, is strengthening relationships with other countries that broadly share our values and face similar constraints. Now, that means Canada. In Europe, that means Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and a lot of other European countries. In Asia, it's going to include Singapore, Japan, and South Korea. And of course, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia. I'm sure I've missed a bunch, but we already have bilateral trade agreements, security arrangements, and or multilateral frameworks with all of these countries. So the infrastructure that we need exists. What should be changing, though, is how seriously we treat those relationships and how much we invest in them. When the system was stable, depth didn't matter as much because you could kind of assume markets would stay open and that disputes would be managed somewhere else. Now, with the system under strain, that depth becomes leverage. Working more closely with others doesn't mean forming a bloc necessarily. It means coordinating where interests align and overlap on trade, on energy, on standards, on supply chains, so that nobody is in a position where they're negotiating entirely alone. And this is, I think, where reasonable people will disagree. Some are going to say, no, this spreads Australia too thin, and we don't have the resources to pursue multiple avenues simultaneously. Others will say, look, it's the only way to avoid being squeezed as pressure from superpowers grows. What's clear, though, is that the conversation has shifted and continues to shift. Countries aren't asking whether the old order will return for the most part. They're asking how to operate if it doesn't. I'm interested to know where you land on this. Does upgrading these partnerships and these relationships strengthen Australia's position, or does it complicate it? And where do you think the real risks sit? Now, when people talk about geopolitics, I know it can feel pretty abstract, but this stuff shows up very, very quickly in business decisions, where you invest, who you rely on, and how exposed you are when the rules shift. That is why I built the blueprint for international success, which you can find here on the channel. The link is in the description. Now, the blueprint is not about geopolitics. It's not about stuff at this level. It's a practical framework for scaling businesses internationally in exactly this kind of environment. If you're a person who is responsible for real cross-border decisions, that's where this thinking gets translated into something usable. Check it out.